These notes are from Chapter 16, Section 4 of your textbook, and these notes outline what evidences do we have that help support Darwin's theory of evolution. And so each Roman numeral, I'm going to go over one of the major evidence items that we have that support the theory of evolution. So our first one is probably the most obvious, and that's the fact that we have fossils. Darwin argued that living things have been evolving on Earth for millions of years. And the definition of a fossil is a remnant or trace of an organism of a past geologic age, such as a skeleton or imprint. Embedded and preserved in the Earth's crust. And by Darwin's time, people knew that fossils were the remnants of ancient life and that they were found in distinct layers of rock. And these layers represented certain times in the past. And now we're able to date rock and kind of get an idea of how old that rock is. But the concept that lower layers of rock are older than higher layers of rock gives you an idea of the relative age of a fossil. If you don't have any way of dating the rock, you can at least say that something deeper in the ground is older than something higher in the ground. And that's because sediments are layered on top of each other, kind of like an onion, and the newest sediments are deposited higher up than older sediments. So if you find fossils in rock, and I'm actually just kind of looking at the picture below, you can get an idea if the fossils change, because you can see the older version in lower rock and how it changes in layers that get higher and higher up the rock. Since Darwin's time, the number of known fossil forms has grown, and what are called transitional fossils that demonstrate immediate stages of modern species have been discovered. So what transitional fossils are the versions of a species in between a very ancient version and the modern day version. Many gaps remain in the fossil record. So we don't have every single transitional species that has ever existed, but that doesn't necessarily disprove evolution. It just shows that we have uncertainties in the way that species have evolved. A really nicely documented species that we have fossils for, and we can see how it has evolved over time, is the horse. And it's really fascinating because the horse has evolved to walk on one toe. But if you go back in time, its ancestor had many toes, kind of like, a dog or a cat. And we do have the fossils to show the transitional loss of the toes. The picture on the right-hand side was taken from a museum, and these are the fossils of ancient versions of the horse, the modern horse. And you can see that they still had their toes, but they were kind of in a transition period where they still had them, but they weren't actually fully functioning toes. And then the modern horse is kind of a little bit cut off, but off to the right, the toes are gone. So the second evidence for evolution is called homologous body structures. And essentially what homologous structures are the fact that even though the job of the body part might be different, the anatomy is the same. And so the best example is with vertebrates. So the similarities are with vertebrates. And there's an I there, sorry. The most well-documented similarity is with the forearm. And the forearm has a different form, but internally, the bones are all the same. So down here, you have a human, you have a cat, you have a whale, you have a bat. And since we've already done anatomy, you get a really good idea of the bones. You know that the humerus is in the upper arm and the radius in the ulnar in the lower arm. You have carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Well, a cat has the same bones. You might not realize it because a whale, they have like a flipper, so you don't think about bones being in there. But if you were to dissect a whale's flipper, you would see that they have a humerus, they have a radius, they have an ulna, they have carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So whales have fingers inside there, which is amazing. And a bat has a radius, an ulna, a humerus, and phalanges again. So now the fact that they have all the same internal anatomy, but the job of the forearm is different. So a bat uses its forearm for flight. A whale uses it for steering, maneuvering in the water. A cat walks on its toes for stealth. And then obviously humans have the ability to grasp with their opposable thumb, but the internal anatomy is the same. So each of these limbs are examples of adaptations to allow the organism to survive in its particular environment. Structures that have the same, that have different functions but the same embryonic tissues are called homologous structures. Now, as a side note, when an organism has the same job but a different internal anatomy, so it's almost like the exact opposite as homologous structures, those are called analogous structures. And analogous structures are not good evidence items for a close evolutionary relationship. Homologous structures are good evidence of a close evolutionary relationship. So a good example of an analogous structure is you have a bird that can fly with its wing, and you have insects that can fly with their wings. They both evolved flight independently of each other, and so the fact they both have wings, those wings are not very closely related. The third evidence item for that helps to support evolution are vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are organs that are so reduced in size that they are just traces of what they used to be. They no longer serve much of a function for the organism. And that body part probably served a larger function in an ancient form of the organism. But in the modern times, because of environmental changes and selection pressures, the organism actually lost that body part or lost the ability to use that body part because of changes in the environment. So with time, the body part was selected against and essentially disappeared. Really good examples are whales. They have what's left of a pelvis because the ancestor to the modern day whale was a land mammal, and that mammal went back to the sea to start to utilize a resource that was being underutilized for food, and then eventually lost the ability to walk, and over millions of years gained a tail and lost its limbs. So, but what's left of the pelvis of that ancestor is actually still there. Humans have a tailbone. Snakes have, if you were to dissect inside of them, they have what's left of legs from their lizard relatives. So they've lost the ability to walk. And then you could argue that the appendix is a section of the large intestine that no longer serves a major function. So those are all vestigial structures, and vestigial structures help to support that organisms have changed over time. Fourth is similarities in embryology. The embryos of vertebrates look very similar. So if you were to just look at the embryos above this line, you've got a human, a rabbit, a cow, a pig, a chicken, a tortoise, a salamander, and a fish. If I were to ask you which embryo is which without telling you which one was which, I think you'd have a pretty hard time of actually discerning which one is the rabbit and which one's the chicken. But as the embryos develop, they do start to take on their characteristic traits that you can then begin to discern. Oh, well, it looks like over here we've got the mammals, and we've got a bird, and we've got a reptile, and these look like they're aquatic organisms. One essentially is a fish, and one is a salamander. But what this is telling us is that the same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in a similar pattern to produce the tissues and organs of all vertebrates. I was about to say organism. So these tissue development patterns are similar, and that implies that all vertebrates have a common ancestor because of their similarities in development. Finally, the last evidence/support item for evolution is the most modern evidence item, and that is genetic material. You can compare organisms' DNA, you can compare their proteins, and the more that their DNA and their genes have in common, the more that their proteins have in common, you can argue the more closely they are related. So the more related two species are, the closer their DNA is. Two species with very similar DNA can often mate and have offspring. It just depends upon the circumstance and how close the DNA is, but rarely can the offspring be fertile. A really good example is a mule, which is a cross between a donkey and a horse. A donkey and a horse are so genetically similar that they can have offspring together, but they are two different species. But their offspring are sterile. So mules cannot have offspring themselves. Other examples are lions and tigers. You've maybe heard of a liger. They are sterile as well. Now that you guys know about gel electrophoresis and banding patterns, since we did that topic earlier this year, you hopefully remember that the bands represent pieces of DNA that you can cut up with restriction enzymes. And if you were to run a gel with different species, the more bands you have in common, the more closely related the organism is with another species. So you can run a gel electrophoresis to determine the relationships of various species. The more bands you have in common, the more closely related they are. So, for example, down here, if you were to run this gel, and here is our unknown organism, and we're looking at which one of the 2, 3, or 4 is it most closely related to, it looks like 1 and 3 have several bands in common, which means that they might be pretty closely related. They're not the same species, but they are closely related. You can also look at amino acids. Remember that amino acids join to make a protein, and if you have two organisms that have a really similar amino acid sequence, that means that the gene that codes for that protein must be similar. So comparing proteins gets you to the same end result, in that looking at proteins, if they're similar, you can also assume that the genes are similar and they have a more recent common ancestor. So that means that they're more closely related. The green table on the left shows hemoglobin, which is that protein in red blood cells, and how many differences in amino acids humans have with 6 species. And if you were to compare a human and a gorilla, they only have 1 amino acid difference in their hemoglobin. A rhesus monkey and a human is 8, a mouse 27. And then looking at like an organism that's not really closely related to a human, a lamprey, they have 125 differences. So the more differences, the farther away a common ancestor was with a human. The fewer differences, the more recent there was a common ancestor. So just to recap, the evidence items that support evolution are the fossil record, homologous body structures, so structures that have the same internal anatomy but might have a different function, vestigial structures, so structures that performed a job in an ancestral version of the organism but no longer have a function in the modern version, similarities in embryology, and finally similarities in DNA and proteins, macromolecules.